Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the signal, although it only lasted 72 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static, and that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that, it transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous, or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, as the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past 0 through 9 and made its way into the letters all the way up to letter U, and it held it for 72 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 72 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it, and that signal dropped all the way back down. So when Amon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point, and from that point forward, this transmission became the WOW signal. One of the main reasons the WOW signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrence is because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers, they had 50 of them, and anytime they were aiming their dish in a direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio, listen to music, those are targeted radio waves, meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency. And only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is a non-natural radio wave. The night that the WOW signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others, meaning the WOW signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this WOW signal, it's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused the WOW signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained.
Our next story is called Better Than Earth.
Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them, and of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them, scientists now say, are most likely habitable. There's really two criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. One, it needs to be rocky, and two, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation, and we've detected strange signals emanating from the nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth, and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked and in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now, or could be life, is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together. So close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others, and you're so close you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds, and in theory, you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 plus planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life. Not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth. Which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Don't Sleep.
Late on the evening of July 27th, 1977, a 21-year-old farmer named Huang Yan Cho walked down a wide, dusty road in the little farming village of Beigao, located in northern China. It had been a very hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked because they were all preparing for the autumn harvest. But even though Huang was totally exhausted and worn down, as he walked down this road, he was whistling an upbeat tune. Because for the first time in a long time, Huang was actually excited about the future. Huang had grown up in a poor family, and he hadn't even finished elementary school. He still lived with his parents in a tiny house, and basically every day of his life was the same. He got up at sunrise, he walked to work, he worked all day until he barely could even stand, and then he would walk home and he would go to bed. But the reason Huang was now feeling kind of excited about his future was because he had just gotten engaged to a beautiful girl in a neighboring village, and their plan was to get married after the autumn harvest. Huang was already hard at work, literally building them a house that they could move into after they got married. And in fact, on this particular night, that was where Huang was going. He was going to the property where he was in the middle of building this house, and he was going there not to work on the house anymore, but really just to admire his property, because again, he was just so excited about the future. Huang turned the corner and his beautiful half-constructed home came into focus. The foundation, the walls, and the ceiling were all complete. All he had left to do was put in the windows and the doors. And so Huang walked up and ran his hand over the beautiful brick he'd laid around the outside of the property. Brick was not cheap. He had worked extra hours to afford this brick. And so he was just so proud of it. And he ran his hand over it. And then he kind of stepped back and kind of imagined the house when it was all done. And then when he felt satisfied that he had seen enough, he just kind of nodded and turned and just continued walking back towards his home, his parents' home, which was only a few minutes away. When Huang got to his home, he went inside and his mom already had a meal made for him. It was just some rice and veggies. And so Huang sat down and began eating, and then his parents came over and they began chatting. And then, of course, the conversation shifted to Huang's upcoming marriage, because that's basically all Huang ever wanted to talk about. And then by about 10 p.m., Huang was so tired that he crawled into his bed and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, when Huang's parents woke up, they discovered that Huang was not in his bed. Now, this was not totally unusual because they knew their son was a really hard worker, and it wasn't unusual for him to wake up really, really early to head out to the farm to begin his workday. But a little while later, the workers at the rice farm where Huang worked, they saw Huang had not come to work. And because that was so out of character for him, one of the workers actually walked to Huang's parents' home to see if he was okay. And when Huang's mother found out her son had not shown up to work, she was really worried. But she told this worker, my son must have gone to the house he's building, go over there and see if he's there. But the worker from the rice farm went to Huang's property he was building and nobody was there. And so when he came back and told Huang's mother, this sent her into a total panic because really for her, this was like completely out of character for her son. He would never miss work. He would never just disappear like this. Something was wrong. So Huang's mother sent this rice farm worker to go find her husband and tell him what was going on with Huang. And then in the meantime, Huang's mother just walked outside and began going door to door, asking neighbors if they knew where her son was and if they wouldn't mind coming out and helping her look. Now, at this time, the village of Beigao was a relatively small place where all the residents more or less knew each other. And so it did not take long for the news of Huang being missing to spread all across Beigao, and the community really came out in force to go look for him. And so by the afternoon, you had villagers all over the place, literally biking all around town, calling out for Huang. People had gone to neighboring villages to see if he was there. Some other people went to Huang's fiance's home and spoke directly to the fiance, but she had no idea where Huang had gone. And so by about the early afternoon, when so many people couldn't find any leads to where Huang had gone, it became clear that really nobody had a clue what happened to him. Now, Beigao at the time was incredibly isolated. This is a small town where most of the people who live there don't have phones, they don't have cars, they ride their bikes everywhere, and there were no roads that connected Beigao to any other place. Now, there was a paved road that went through Beigao, but it actually just came to an end on the outskirts of Beigao. So there was just no way to go to other places, at least not efficiently. Basically, if you lived in Beigao at the time, there was a finite number of places you could go. And all these people that had gone out looking for Huang had searched all of those places, and Huang just was not there. And they discovered his bike was still leaning up against his parents' house, and his work clothes, which he wore basically every single day, were still folded up neatly inside of his room. And so wherever Huang was, he was on foot and he was still in his pajamas. That night, Huang's parents would contact the village committee, which was basically like the governing body for Beigao. And the village committee decided that this was serious enough, because again, they're thinking, this is impossible. Where is this guy? That they decided to contact the police. But when the police got this call, they did not launch an investigation right away because they had limited resources and there was no sign of foul play here. It was very weird that Huang was missing, but he was an adult, and if he wanted to go vanish somewhere, it was kind of like, okay, you're an adult, you can do that. And so Huang's family and the rest of the Beigao villagers were forced to just kind of wait and see if Huang came back. But over the next few days, Huang did not come back, and there was still no new information about what might have happened to him. Early on the morning of August 5th, so 8 days after Huang went missing, and still by this point there's no sign of him, the deputy director of the Beigao Village Committee came running up the road to Huang's parents' house and knocked on the door. When the door opened up, it was Huang's father, and the deputy director handed him a telegram he had just gotten and said, "Read it." And so Huang's father took the telegram and began reading it, and as he did, his eyes went wide, and then when he was done, he looked up and he was just so confused. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at around 9 a.m. on July 28th, so basically right around the time that Huang's family discovered Huang was missing was when this telegram was sent. But for whatever reason, the telegram had been very delayed, and so they were just receiving this telegram now, 8 days later. And the contents of this telegram made no sense. It said that just 9 hours after Huang had fallen asleep in his parents' home, he was discovered lying on the sidewalk in the middle of this bustling city called Nanjing, located 600 miles to the north of Beigao. Now, the reason Huan's father and the deputy director were so confused by this telegram was this was impossible. Remember, Huan does not have a car, so the only way he could get around was on foot or on his bike, and we know he left his bike by his house. So he's on foot and very likely in his pajamas. And what? He's going to go 600 miles to the north? I mean, even if he walked the 30 miles to the nearest train station, 9 hours, because that's how much time it took from falling asleep to being discovered in the city, is not enough time to go the remaining 570 miles to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director, they talked about this, and they both decided that, this just can't be true. Clearly, somebody has mistaken some other person for Huang, because he cannot possibly be all the way in Nanjing. Now, this telegram said that Huang was being held in a deportation center in Shanghai, and so Huang's father and the deputy director decided they would send a telegram back to the sender at this deportation center and tell them, hey, if this really is Huang, he should have a very specific birthmark on his wrist. And so when they sent this telegram off, they fully expected to get one back that said, our mistake, it wasn't him. But they got a reply relatively quickly, and it said, oh yeah, he's got that exact birthmark. It's definitely Huang, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. And so somebody from your village has to go get him. Huang arrived back home in the middle of August, so about 2 weeks after he had gone missing. And as soon as he got there, his fiance and his parents were so happy to see him, and pretty soon a steady stream of friends and neighbors and other family members began coming to Huang's house to talk to him, to hear his story, to hear about what happened. I mean, this is a tiny, isolated place in the middle of rural China. Not a lot of exciting things happen out here, and so people were really excited to hear what Huang had to say. But Huang really didn't understand what had happened to him, and so mostly he just didn't answer any questions he got asked. He just kind of kept his head down and just kept saying, I don't know what happened. And then really when his family pressed him and said, you gotta tell us, this is so crazy, what happened? He would say, look, I'm gonna tell you what happened, but I don't even know if I can believe the things I'm gonna tell you. And so Huang would say, all he could remember was he went to bed in his own bed in Beigao. And then the next morning he woke up and he was laying on the sidewalk. And when he opened his eyes, he saw there was this big swimming pool, and then near it was a sign that said Nanjing. And so that was how he put together that he was in Nanjing. And then almost immediately, these two police officers wearing all white just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and they walked up to Huang, they scooped him up, and without really saying anything to him, they brought him to that deportation center in Shanghai, which is a place where people who seem confused or mentally ill would be sent in order to help them get home. And that was it. That was Huang's entire story, that he just basically woke up in Nanjing with no idea how he got there. And so after he told his family, they all just kind of looked at him like, really? Like, that's what happened? That makes no sense. But Huang, he was completely lucid. He was explaining it really specifically and really simply. He looked and sounded exactly like he normally did, and he seemed very honest as he was telling the story. Over the next few weeks, Huang kind of reintegrated back into his life, but things just were not the same. People were now scared of him. Kids literally ran away from him when they saw him because rumors were going around town that he himself, his body, was haunted or something. And so kids were scared of him, and other villagers would openly gossip about him right in front of him. Even his beloved fiancée admitted to feeling really uncomfortable around him now. And while all of this was obviously very upsetting for Huang, he did also understand why people were acting this way. This is a very anomalous thing that's happened to him, and he did not have a good explanation for this totally insane event that he was a part of. And so he just kind of got it. And in fact, Huang himself was kind of terrified of himself. At night when he would go to bed, he would be terrified that the second he closed his eyes, he was going to be transported hundreds or thousands of miles away to some totally unknown place, and maybe this time he wouldn't even be able to get back again. But as the days wore on, Huang continued to wake up in his own bed in Beigao, which over time kind of made him feel more secure that whatever happened to him was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again. However, Huang would be wrong. On September 8th, 1977, so 3 weeks after Huang had returned back home, he went to sleep in his bed in the village of Beigao, but when he woke up the next morning, he was not there. The first thing Huang noticed when he woke up that morning were the sounds around him were totally different. They were not right. Normally, when he was asleep in his home, he would hear the sound of his mother and father snoring right by him, and he might hear some insects or birds out his window. And those sounds were gone. Instead, he heard what sounded like footsteps, but not ordinary footsteps. They were footsteps of somebody walking on cement who was wearing high heels, like a clicking sound. And then Huang also became aware of the fact that his face was clearly pressed up against cement. He was laying on the ground. But Huang couldn't open his eyes. As hard as he tried, he couldn't do it. He couldn't move his body. And so he's just laying there on cement with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of these footsteps, these high heels, getting closer and closer and closer. And as they did, his anxiety was growing and growing. He had no idea who this person was. And then these footsteps, they got right up to him and then passed by him. And Huang felt the breeze as this person walked right past him. And then after this person in high heels had kind of walked off in the other direction, Huang finally was able to wrench open his eyes, and he sat up and he looked around, and one, he couldn't find anybody. It was totally abandoned all around him. So whoever had those high heels on had somehow vanished in plain sight. And then also, as Huang continued to look around him, it looked like he was in the middle of this city. But again, there's nobody out there. It's like this abandoned city street. All he had in front of him was this clock up on a building that said 1 a.m. And so pretty soon, Huang was just kind of walking in circles, screaming out for help. And right when he was about to just start sprinting in any one direction in hope that help would be somewhere out there, Huang felt a tap on his shoulder. And then the person tapping him from behind him said, "Are you Huang Yanzhou?" Huang spun around and he saw there were these two men in military uniforms standing there. And for a second, Huang felt relieved. Somebody was here to help him. But then he thought to himself, how do they know my name? What's going on here? And so he asked them, how do you know my name? But the two men didn't answer Huang. Instead, they told him that he was at a Shanghai railway station 700 miles from Beigao, and that they, these two soldiers, were here to take Huang to a nearby army base. At this point, Huang was so scared, he just didn't know what to do. So he just wound up going with these two soldiers who put him in the back of a Jeep. And then they hopped in and began driving, and they drove him out of this weird abandoned city where he had woken up. And after driving for some time, they arrived at this huge army base that had all these rows of fencing around it with razor wire on top and all these sentries that guarded all the doors. And these two soldiers brought him through several of these checkpoints. And then when they reached the very last one, they stopped the car, they got out, Huang got out too, and the two soldiers that were with him grabbed Huang's shoulders, and they basically led him through the last checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And as Huang was led through this gate, the armed guards seemed to not even notice the soldiers or Huang. It was like they were invisible to the armed guards. But either way, they got through the final checkpoint, and then the two soldiers that were carrying Huang led him to this kind of nondescript big building, and they opened up a door, and they began walking down this long hallway that kind of zigged and zagged. It was like a maze of different directions you could go. And then finally, they brought Huang right to this big door that said Division Headquarters over it. And then before Huang could say anything, one of the two soldiers that was with him knocked on the door. And then before anybody could respond, that same soldier reached down, opened it up, swung the door in, and then they pushed Huang inside, and they stepped in after him and shut the door behind them. In front of Huang was this big desk, and sitting behind this desk was a very senior-looking military official wearing a uniform. And this official, when they looked up and saw Huang standing there, they got up to their feet and put their hands on their gun and said, "What are you doing here? How'd you get in here?" And Huang, sensing there was something wrong, threw his hands up to show he was not a threat and pointed behind him and said, "They brought me here." And the military official, who still had his hand on his gun, looked behind Huang and said, "Who brought you here?" And Huang, he turned around and he saw the two soldiers who had picked him up and driven him here and led him to this room. They were gone. Which was impossible because Huang would have heard them leave. He didn't hear anything. The door never opened. They just somehow were gone. A second later, the senior military official had pulled out his radio and he was screaming commands. And then another second later, armed soldiers came running into the room. They grabbed Huang, who still had his hands up. They came in, they arrested Huang, and they began asking him all these questions about how he got in here. How did you get through the guards? Did you climb the fence? Did you cut the fence? How did you get in here? It's not possible that you are here right now. But Huang did not have any answers. All he could say was, "The two soldiers, they brought me here."
A girl came round and stole his heart with eyes that sparkled like the stars. She moved him like no one before, the boy and girl forevermore. Hand in hand they stroll the night, two hearts beating pure delight. Their love a dance beneath the moon, together always one sweet June. She whispered dreams of far-off lands. He held her close with gentle hands. Their happiness a living art, two lives entwined right from the start. They laughed and cried and shared their fears through all the smiles and salty tears. Their love a tale of joy and pain, the sunburst blooming after no words can say what they both knew. Their love a bond that's strong and true. With every step the world did see, a perfect match eternally. Hand in hand they stroll the night.
A couple of days later, Huang would be bussed back to Beigao, and again, his friends and family and everybody in town had all these questions about what happened, but again, Huang just had no answers. And then just 11 days after coming back home the second time, Huang would disappear again. And this time he would tell people he encountered two men who told him they were the same two men from the other two times he had gone missing. You had the first instance where he woke up and two police officers in white picked him up off the ground and brought him to the deportation center. And then the second time was the military base where you had those two soldiers who brought him through the gates and brought him to division headquarters. Basically, these two men he encountered on the third trip were saying they were the same men across all three instances. And on this third instance that he went missing, Huang said these two men put him on their backs and they flew him to 9 different cities around China for reasons unknown, and then they flew him back to Beigao and just dropped him off right outside his house near a tree, and that was it. Now, of course, this final disappearance sounds the most absurd because what, he was flying on the backs of people to all these different cities? That doesn't make any sense. But when Huang was kind of aggressively questioned about this third story, because it sounded the most made up as compared to the other two, it would turn out Huang had all this kind of insider information about each of the 9 cities that he supposedly was flown to by these two men. He knew the weather in each of those cities on the night that he was gone. He knew what shows were playing on the night he was gone. And he also just had really specific descriptions of where he was in each of these cities when they got there that all checked out. Now, you gotta remember that getting that information correct would have been really hard for Huang at the time. He did not have internet access. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have a car. I mean, he lives in an isolated small village in rural China. So the idea that literally the morning after all this happens, he's flown to these different cities, that he would have all this information perfectly correct, that's hard to do. That would be hard to lie about. As of today, no one has ever been able to debunk Huang's stories. Basically, there's enough legitimacy and verifiable information in his stories that you really can't discount them. They really could have happened. Add in the fact that Huang actually took a lie detector test and passed it, and suddenly you're looking at a story that, as crazy as it sounds, really could have happened. And so Huang's story today is considered far and away the most famous UFO story in China's history, because the leading theory here is that Huang must have been abducted by aliens, and that's how he was being moved around to all these places, and maybe those two men that kept showing up in each of these events were the extraterrestrials that had scooped him up. Nobody knows, but that is the theory. As for Huang, he wishes none of this had ever happened, because his disappearances and whatever happened to him basically wrecked his life. His fiancée broke up with him because she was so uncomfortable around him, and there was a lot of stigma around Huang, especially in the village where everybody thought he was a liar. And then on top of that, all these news and film and TV crews came to the village because they wanted to shoot shows and documentaries about Huang, and Huang did not want anything to do with them. But again, like, all these people are coming to the village for Huang, and it's making the rest of the villagers upset. And then also there was a really lengthy investigation by the police and by the military to try to figure out how in the world Huang got into that army base. I mean, there were layers and layers of security that he somehow got through, and all those armed guards that were watching the gates said they never saw Huang walk through, even though Huang said he literally just walked through the gate with the two soldiers that were carrying him through. And so today, Huang actually still lives in Beigao, and he had a son and a daughter, and he has grandkids, but he refuses to talk about what happened to him because, again, it wrecked his life.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.